Thank you all so much for joining us for another SAG-AFTRA program on YouTube. To stay current with all of our video events, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. We are joined today by American Sign Language interpreters Billy Sanders and Susan Wheeler. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded so you can watch the replay on SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel, along with a vast catalog of other great content. Today, we are turning our eye towards broadcasting on this program with a look at personal service agreements. What are personal service agreements? It is a contract between media professionals and their employers, often used within the broadcasting industry. Sounds simple, right? Well, there's actually a lot more to personal service agreements than just being a type of employment contract, and sometimes they can be pretty complex. So that is why we have brought in SAG-AFTRA Chief Broadcast Officer for the SAG-AFTRA News and Broadcast Department, Mary Cavallaro, to give us a brief overview of personal service agreements. Mary has served SAG-AFTRA members for more than 15 years, starting with the AFTRA Philadelphia local. She oversees the negotiation and administration of more than 250 labor agreements between SAG-AFTRA and network and local broadcast employers nationwide. She also chairs the national negotiations for the network news agreements and negotiations with employers with operations in multiple markets. Mary, so good to see you again. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get started.
Thank you, Ben. Very happy to be here. And I'm going to get started by sharing my screen. And I'm going to walk everyone through what I call some of the very, very critical provisions in a personal service contract. There are many of them, and you will basically get an overview of the key provisions. That said, I don't want anybody to think that there may be a provision that I don't mention that isn't as important. And so the key thing that I want everybody to remember is to ask questions. Never read something, not understand it, and don't ask a question. And SAG-AFTRA is available to our members and even our non-members who work in the industry who need help. So just to start, SAG-AFTRA is a union that represents people in broadcast, professionals in broadcast. And many of our members work under a personal service contract. That's a personal employment contract that you have directly with your employer, but you also have your union contract. The important thing to remember is the union contract always sets the minimum, sets the floor. That's called a minimum terms contract. You can always bargain for more in your personal service contract above that, but the union contract always sets the floor. And so that's why it's important to know that if something in your personal service contract seems like it conflicts with the union contract, you want to talk to the union and see what provision applies and whether the union contract trumps that provision or how they interact. Moving on to, a second key issue is term of employment. I tell people who are working in this industry that this is the most important provision in your agreement, and it's often overlooked. A lot of people who work at this industry, the first thing they do is they go to the compensation piece, and that's natural. Everybody understands why you would do that. But the term of employment is key, and we'll go through a number of provisions where you'll see why it is so key. The term of employment basically talks about how long will I stay at this job? When can I get out of this job? Can I break my contract? And can my employer let me go before the end of the term of the contract? So here's some examples of term provisions from a personal service contract. The basic term provision essentially says that you're going to be employed or exclusive to an employer for a certain period of time. It could be 6 months, could be 1 year, could be 3 years, it could be more. But that's a basic term that's important to know and to look at and to understand. Why? Because that is what you are committing to for this employer. You are promising to stay with them for that period of time. Second, term cycles plus option. Essentially, you may have a term agreement, but there are certain cycles inside that term that impact when you could be let go or when you yourself can perhaps leave. And then there might be an option at the end of a term that would allow your employer to extend the agreement further. And then finally, there might be a reference to what we call at-will employment. And that means you may be promising them certain things, but essentially you're at will, meaning you have no contract or no obligation from your employer to keep you. The second term or provision of a personal service contract that I ask people to look at very carefully is the termination section. Now, the first thing you want to think about when you're getting a job is not terminating your employment, but here's why it's so important. Because it basically tells you when your employer can let you go and when you can leave. And so that's important to know, because sometimes the term is a little misleading. So here I show you an example of a term provision where you're promising to stay with this employer for 3 years. And you'll see the term of first day of September 2014 ending on the 31st day of August 2017, 3-year contract. So you think perhaps when you're reading that, wow, I am promising to stay with this employer for 3 years and they are promising to keep me for 3 years. Do not think that is the case, because in the termination provision will be the instances where your employer can terminate the agreement short of that 3 years. So here you'll see an example of a provision where the employer can terminate the agreement, the 3-year agreement, on the anniversary date year of the contract by giving you 60 days notice. So what that means in this case is September 1st, 2015, 60 days prior to that date, the employer can send you a letter and say, we know we promised, we know that we hired you for 3 years. We are exercising our option to terminate early on the anniversary date. So you thought you had a 3-year contract, but you don't. And so that's why it's important to really understand those provisions and how they work. Also, it's important to understand what these two terms mean, cause and without cause. An employer will have language in your personal employment agreement allowing them to terminate you for cause. And what this means is if you engage in some kind of activity or conduct that might be a violation of their policy, might be something incredibly egregious in terms of your conduct. And in those cases, the employer, without any notice, can terminate you for cause. And there are certain variables that come into play in that case. If they're terminating you for cause, you are most probably not entitled to severance pay. And in some cases, when an employer terminates you for cause, they will basically prevent you from filing for unemployment, which is something you're going to need if you're being terminated. If you are at a union station and something like this happens to you, I urge you to contact your union representative. If you're not at a union station or you're not yet a member of SAG-AFTRA and you have questions in this area, I still urge you to contact the union or somebody else who might be able to assist you, because in those cases, you want to get help. Without cause, that's the ability for the employer not to have a reason for which to terminate you. And the employer may put in the agreement certain provisions which allow them to do this with a certain amount of notice. And so they don't need to have a reason to let you go. And so it's important to understand that. This is a provision, liquidated damages, that we see in some of our employment agreements that our members have with their employers. If a member wants to leave short of the full term that they've committed to for their employer, they may be required to pay a penalty to do that. And what does that mean? That means that the employer essentially has language in the agreement that says they can terminate. If you want to terminate the agreement, if you want to leave on your own, go someplace else, we will let you if you pay us this amount of money. If you don't have a provision in your contract for liquidated damages, you can still potentially ask out of your contract, and your employer may allow you to terminate your contract and leave. Generally, if you're going to go to the competition, They will not allow that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But essentially, you can always request to be let out of your contract, but when you make a commitment of 2 years, of 3 years, they're looking for you to fulfill that. Services and duties. I also ask people to look closely at this language in the contract. What is the job? How is it being described? In most cases, employers will have what I call a very broad description of what your job duties are. And they do that so they can change them mid-contract. They want the flexibility to move you around. They don't want to necessarily commit to your being the 6 o'clock anchor or the drive time reporter. They want the ability to say, you know what, this isn't working out, or we think you'd be better here. And so they will put in a very broad clause, which means that you can't renegotiate. If it's very specific, as that first provision references, then you do have the ability to negotiate if they want to change your assignment. And then what I call the sneaky specific is you have to really read these closely, because it may seem like they're committing to you for a specific position, 6 and 11 o'clock anchor in this example. They're actually, with the underlying portion of that provision, allowing themselves to reassign you. So they're saying upfront, this is what we intend to hire you for, but that may change over time. Compensation. Okay, we're finally getting to the money, and that's what's important to a lot of you. I understand that. So what are they paying me? In this slide, I share exactly how some of our contracts are structured. You know, you're paid on an annual basis, a certain amount based on a term. This is a 3-year contract example. Exempt or non-exempt. This is important because this goes to whether you're entitled to be paid overtime under your agreement. If you're exempt, you're not entitled to be paid overtime. If you're non-exempt, you are, which means that that compensation that's outlined above may increase based on the amount of work that you do. Complete agreement provision. This is incredibly important. If you are negotiating for a job and they promise you something that's not put in writing, there will be a provision in your personal service contract that essentially says, if it's not in this agreement, you're not entitled to it. So sometimes this happens. Your boss says, oh, I'll give you an extra week of vacation, but I don't want to put that in writing. Be careful about those conversations. Maybe ask them to send you an email, because if it's not in your contract, you're going to have a hard time enforcing it. And I always tell people to get everything that you want in writing, whether it's a signing bonus, a moving allowance, you know, a cell phone, different perks, clothing allowance. Make sure you get those in writing, because if it's not, it's hard to enforce, especially if your boss perhaps changes over the term of your employment. Exclusivity. Can I freelance for ESPN on the side? Can I write a book? Can I have my own website? With an exclusivity provision, which is very common in our members' personal service contracts, this means that you are committing to this employer full-time, that you're promising that all of the time that you spend working is going to be spent working for the employer with whom you sign this agreement. So don't assume that you can just maybe moonlight, is the term that used to be used. Don't assume that you could do things for which you want to be paid and not have your employer have a problem with it. This is an example of an exclusivity provision. It's very common. If you want to do something on the side, you're going to have to ask for your manager's approval to do that, and you want to get that in writing. And in some cases, your manager or your employer will say, you know what, that conflicts with what we do. There might be a journalistic integrity issue. There might be a concern that you're going to be spending too much time doing it. It might be a concern that you're actually competing with them. So these kinds of things that I have listed on the in the side there, the freelancing, the books, the consulting, the websites, acting, voiceover, all of those kinds of things are subject to this exclusivity clause. So you want to make sure if you do something, you want to be doing something on the side, you spell that out in the beginning. And I'm going to walk you through something very complicated that's in our agreements. And I'm going to do it rather quickly, but this is an area where you should be focusing attention as well when you're looking at these contracts. Restrictive covenants. These are provisions in your personal service contract that essentially prevent you from doing things during your employment and even after your employment. So I'll walk you through these examples. You cannot be talking to our competition during the term of your PSC, meaning you can't be looking for a job while you're employed with us and talking to our competition. You're fired, but you can't work for our competition. That's a non-compete. You're fired, but if you get another offer, you have to let us try and keep you and match it. And yes, that does exist in our contract. So exclusive negotiations basically is a commitment that for the term of the contract and for a certain period of time, this is 90 days prior to the expiration date, but really 60, because for the last 30 days, they're allowing you to talk to other people. They want you to only be thinking about your job with them, and they don't want you to be talking to anybody else. And that may not be in broadcast, that could be something else, but that they're basically saying you're exclusive to us and you will only negotiate with us. A right of first refusal, another form of restricted covenant. This basically says that if they let you go, or even if you resign, they have a period of time that for which you have to bring them any offer of employment following your employment. And if they match it, you cannot go to that employer. So if they basically terminate you without cause, and the TV station across the street offers you more money to come to them, your current employer can take the position, or your former, that they can match that offer and prevent you from going to the competition. So that's a right of first refusal. And then finally, a non-compete clause. These clauses are not lawful in many states for broadcasters and for everyone in California, for example. But essentially, these prevent you from resigning or even being terminated without cause and taking employment with the competition. And they are defined for a period of time. It could be 6 months, it could be 1 year, and it could define the kinds of jobs you can take. But that's a non-compete clause. Also very important area of negotiation. Intellectual property. This is, you have a franchise that you do, or you have a character that you use on the radio. When you work for an employer, you're basically saying whatever you do, they own and they control, even after you leave. So you're basically committing to their ownership of the intellectual property. Works made for hire, you'll see that referenced in a personal service contract. That essentially says that anything you do during the course of your employment for us, we own, and we own derivative works connected with that. So if you are doing a story for this station, they own the story and they own anything that might come out of it. So that is important, because if you want to negotiate maybe some flexibility to do things after your employment or even during, having a discussion about exclusivity is one thing, but also the intellectual property involved. And I think I made it through all of the key provisions. But again, I want to stress that if you're reading one of these contracts and you're a little confused or concerned, please ask questions, because that's super important.
Amazing. That is a lot. Mary, thank you so much for walking us through all of that. We have some member questions that are familiar, I'm sure, in many ways. They mirror the probably frequently asked questions you get on this topic. First of which is, what advice do you give to a member who is presented their first personal service contract in a new state and asked to move for the position? What advice do you give them?
Well, I always tell journalists they should know this right away, because this is what they do for a living. But journalists need to ask questions. They need to do their research. They need to find out cost of living. They need to find out about the particular station and particular employer in terms of the benefits they offer, the way things work at that particular station. So I always suggest, it may be the union, it may be somebody who with SAG-AFTRA who knows that station because it's a union station. It could be that we even put you in touch with one of our members at that station, ask those questions. But, an example would be if you're taking a job at a TV station where parking is expensive or difficult, you want to know that in advance, because that's going to go into your consideration of a salary. If like everything from taxes to healthcare, those kinds of questions, ask as soon as possible, and don't sign a contract until you've had somebody look it over for you.
Knowledge is power. I love that. All right, next question. This member says, I just received an offer for a contract with a 3-year term, but I'm not sure if I could stay in this part of the country that long. If I'm not happy with the job, can't I just give 2 weeks notice and move on?
Unfortunately not. It's not that simple. And I've had in the last probably 6 months, several journalists just starting out who signed 2-3-year contracts in smaller markets, not making a lot of money. And they learned, they didn't really enjoy the job. They really were having a hard time making ends meet because the pay wasn't great. And they just wanted to move on, or somebody else was looking at them and wanted to offer them a job. And when you've made this commitment to an employer could enforce the terms of that contract. So it's not just as easy as walking away. What could happen in the kind of the worst case scenario is that your employer chooses to bring a cause of action, litigation against you. Something else they can do is threaten any potential employer who is trying to hire you while you're under contract with them. And so, it's not unusual for an employee to be able to ask out of their contract and to get out of a contract. And if you give them enough notice, that sometimes works. And most employers try to work with people. They want to have happy employees, but don't assume that you can just walk away.
That is very good to know. All right, next question. Are non-competes enforceable? What about the right of first refusal? I am in a right to work state and I hear they cannot enforce them.
Yeah, I've heard that with people in right to work states. And so everyone knows what a right to work state is. That's a term that's used to refer to states where unions cannot have union security clauses, meaning they can't require that you pay dues to a union as a condition of employment. But it actually has nothing to do with non-competes. It sounds like it might, but it doesn't. A non-compete, as I mentioned in my presentation, they're unlawful generally in California, but in many states, as a result of the union's work, we passed legislation to make them unlawful in places like New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, I want to say Maine, Connecticut, many locations. But they're also very much legal in a number of states, and they can enforce them, even in cases of where they terminate you. You can negotiate your way out of it in some cases, but don't count on that. And if you are resigning, you're more likely than not to be held to your non-compete. And so, again, something to consult with the union about if you're in a union job.
Sounds like another example of finding out that information ahead of time so you can be fully prepared and know what you're signing up for.
Absolutely.
My father is an attorney and trained me well. Never sign a contract until you have the proper information and consultation. So sounds like another one of those examples that may vary. And again, kudos to you and the various teams who have supported with that legislation in the states that are helping, and more work to be done.
Most definitely.
So this member says, I am a broadcaster in one of the top markets, and my contract outlines termination by the company other than for cause. It reads, the company may terminate performer's employment for any reason or for no reason upon 60 days prior written notice to performer, subject to payment of the termination payments. Can you explain how and when this would apply? Is this similar to the example you gave in your presentation, or maybe something different?
Very similar. So it's 60 days notice. So that means you could have signed a 3-year contract like the one we talked about quite a bit in the presentation, but they have a right to terminate the contract just by giving you 60 days notice, and they don't have to have a reason. They can have a reason. They don't have to have a reason. They can't terminate you for an unlawful reason like discrimination, but they don't need to have a reason. And it was 60 days notice. What that generally means is that they have to pay you through those 60 days. And there may be some severance that's referenced in your contract or in the union contract, which may be considered a termination payment. But that's why it's important to really understand those term provisions, because a lot of people, I can't tell you how many people I've run into who sign a contract thinking they're signing a 3-year deal when there are really many outs in the agreement for the employer.
Okay. Next question. I am a radio broadcaster with a podcast. What should I think about discussing and proposing when approaching personal service contract negotiations and the podcast?
That's a great question, because it's such a developing area right now. A lot of our members are really thinking towards the future and towards ownership. And I referred to works made for hire, and what that talked about, what that means is that the employer basically owns everything you do. And so if you're doing a podcast for a station, they will claim ownership of it. So if it's something you're already doing for them and it's branded by them, you essentially might want to think about compensation, additional compensation related to like advertised sales connected to it. You might want to talk about like what happens if you were to leave. Can you take it with you at that point? You might want to talk about what happens. This is the most common thing I'm hearing about quite a bit now. If a Netflix or another streaming platform comes to you and said, we love that story that you did with your podcast, we want to turn it into a series. And you want to basically establish some kind of right to bargain over how that might be done. You might be concerned with how it's done, but you also might be concerned, of course, with compensation. So there are so many different things, so many different models. I also emphasize we at SAG-AFTRA have standalone podcasting agreements. And so that agreement could be covered. And so I would emphasize that, you know, even if it's not a union station, you have questions, that's an area where SAG-AFTRA has really been very thoughtful as to how to approach the different models, the different revenue streams associated with podcasting.
The brave new world of podcasts, though, maybe not all that new. They've been around, but it is interesting to see how all the different places they're ending up. So great question. Looking at some of the other ancillary costs that can come into play in this type of work, the question is, can hair, makeup, or wardrobe allowances be negotiated into a broadcast personal service contract?
Yes, they can. And I would say that's an area, you know, we talked about getting information, doing your research, where some employers do it more often than others. And a lot of employers, it's not an allowance so much as a reimbursement up to $2,000 or something like that. But I would say that it's something that is, I think, more and more becoming common again. They went away for a little bit, and now employers are finding ways to make those kinds of perks, if you will, available. And I'm a big fan of not leaving any money on the table. So do your research, even talk to us at the union and see what we might know about the practice, but definitely ask for them.
Okay. Last, but certainly not least, how can SAG-AFTRA assist members with personal service contract questions throughout the year? So what are the resources that are available to members from SAG-AFTRA with their questions about all of this?
Sure, great question. And I hope SAG-AFTRA has done a lot of work over the years with training people on how to understand personal service contracts. So we think that we've established ourselves as a resource out there for journalists and other people working in broadcasting to, come to us instead of, maybe going to an attorney who's not familiar with the industry. And we do it without charge. And we just, knowledge is power, as you mentioned, Ben, and we really want people to go into employment with all of the power of that knowledge. Don't be afraid to call us. You can reach out to, whether it's me or we have staff around the country who are trained in how to understand these agreements and how to, give advice and consultation. To be clear, we have more standing at a union station in terms of, providing assistance and, even working with your employer on questions and concerns. But please, even if you are not at a union station, if you're a pre-member of SAG-AFTRA, we want you to have that knowledge and that power.
Hear, hear. Mary, any final thoughts? This has been so supportive. I really appreciate your time.
No, I just hope everybody really appreciates the value of getting some help, getting that knowledge. And, I wish everybody the best in bargaining those personal service contracts, because we want everybody to do well. We want everybody to be able to earn a living in this industry. And, a key element to doing that is really understanding what you've agreed to. So thank you, Ben.
Absolutely. Well, Mary, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Amy Hall, SAG-AFTRA's National Director of News and Broadcast, for helping us put together today's program. As a reminder to everyone watching, this presentation is available as a replay on our YouTube channel. You can watch them anytime, share it with a friend, someone who has these questions. And on behalf of the whole team here at SAG-AFTRA, we would like to thank you very much for watching. And a special thanks to our regular viewers who've been tuning in each week for our educational live streams. If you have ideas for topics you would like to see us cover, please email us at pteoe@sagaftra.org. And before we go, if you haven't already, please subscribe to SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel to get updates on all of the content we are posting. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.